Welcome back to the second part of chapter number 7 of CCNA Cybersecurity Operations with me, Joakim Kävrestad from the University of Skövde. In this part, we'll get a little bit more technical and talking about IP vulnerabilities and threats, as well as TCP IP vulnerabilities and threats. So now we will basically go through a long list of different types of attacks that can happen against our networks. So that's kind of cool. But let me just begin with telling you that the IP protocol was not really designed for security from the beginning. Many of the protocols that the modern day computing rely on was not really designed for security. And some of the aspects or properties of IP is that it's connectionless, it's a best effort protocol, so it doesn't really verify anything about sender or destination. There is no flow control or tracking. There is nothing in IP that ensures that a package gets from source to destination or the other way around. It's a good idea for you to go have a look at the IPv4 and IPv6 headers and the written material just to be familiar with them. I'm not going to show them here because I think that stuff's kind of boring. But know this, that IP in itself does not really provide security. For security functions, we have to rely on other protocols, upper layer or lower, well, primarily upper layer protocols, to be honest. With that said, let's look at some IP-related attacks. So the first one I want to discuss with you is my favorite, denial of service attacks. And a denial of service attack is an attack where the attacker essentially tries to prevent legitimate use of services. So for instance, you might want to mess with a bank, and you mess with a bank by ensuring that the online banking service is not available anymore. So there are basically two main types of denial of service attacks, where the first one is maliciously formatted packages. And what an attacker tries to do here is to create a custom package that they forward to a host. And this custom package contains some sort of payload that is very hard for the host to handle, causing it to crash or just work slowly. The other one is overwhelming quantity of traffic, and this is where you essentially overwhelm a host with data and makes it unable to respond to new requests. And the thing here that makes this kind of complicated to defend against is that the data in itself is often legitimate. So as I'm sure you can appreciate, if you have a server and it just have too much to do, then it's not going to work very well. And that is essentially how a DOS attack with this approach works. So leaving DOS attacks for a while, we can talk a little bit about amplification and reflection. So amplification and reflection, those are techniques that often play a big role in denial of service attacks. And I think it's best to try to describe those with an example. So one example of using amplification is that a threat actor crafts a sample ICMP echo request. So they craft a ping. And in this ping, they use the IP address of the attack target as the source IP address. And then they send this ICMP echo request to a large number of hosts. This will be reflected, and the reflection part is that all hosts will send the echo reply to the attack target because the attack target IP address was used as the source IP address in the echo request. So this is an example of amplification and reflection. Let's carry on to distributed denial of service attacks, and this is a subclass of denial of service attacks, but in this case the attackers use several coordinated sources for the attack. So many hosts sends traffic to the attack target at the same time. And a common way to do this is that the attacker gets access to a botnet, and then they use all the bots in the attack. So this is kind of hard to defend against, especially if the attacker uses legitimate traffic. So if you're, for instance, a web-based newspaper, and what happens in the attack is that there is just a lot of people sending GET requests for your main page at the same time, how should you distinguish those GET requests from legitimate or real GET requests? And what happens if you try to use firewalling to block those GET requests? Well, then eventually the firewall will be exhausted and the denial of service attack will succeed anyway. So anyhow, Even though defending against those is hard, intrusion detection systems, firewalling, and device hardening is of course a key factor. And there are a few things you can do, and we will get back to that, I think, in the end of this lecture. So carrying on with address spoofing. And let's begin with IP spoofing. And IP spoofing attacks are attacks where the attacker creates packets with false address information to hide the sender identity or to pose as a legitimate user. So there are two different things we may want to do here if we're the attacker. Either we want to hide our true identity so that we can do whatever we want to do without getting caught, or we try to impersonate a legitimate user. And usually we do this because we want to have some kind of privileges that legitimate user have. So we can do this IP spoofing either non-blind or blind. And non-blind spoofing is when we as the attacker can see the traffic between the host and target. And we can, for instance, use this for session hijacking. So, for instance, there may be an established TCP session, and we want to hijack the session in between and be one of the parties in that session. Blind spoofing is when the attacker cannot see the traffic, and this is more commonly used in denial of service attacks. If we have access to an internal network, we can use MAC address spoofing. And one approach for MAC address spoofing is, for instance, that the attacker alters his MAC address to match the MAC address of another host. And doing this, we cause switches to send us frames instead of the intended real host, and this way we can steal sensitive data. So that was the IP part. MAC address spoofing was in there for some reason. I don't really know why, but let's move on to TCP and TCP related attack. So let's briefly review. TCP is a layer 4 protocol where we have session establishment, we have this reliable delivery using sequence numbering, all the segments are numbered, and the receiving host acknowledged that the segments has been received. We also have some flow control that tells us how many segments we send in a row before we expect an acknowledgement package and stuff like that. There are, of course, a number of TCP attacks that can be used to attack TCP. One of them is the TCP reset attack that is essentially used to terminate the session between two hosts. So this is sort of a denial of service attack. And what we do here is that we spoof an IP address, and then we send the spoofed packet. We send a spoofed packet posing as one of the session hosts, and we terminate the connection. So we send an RST package to terminate an ongoing session. Something that's a little bit more malicious is the TCP session hijacking attack. This is a tricky attack to carry out, but what it does is that it allows us to take over as one of the hosts in an established TCP session. And what we should know here is that when two hosts establish a TCP session, they will send data between one another, and they will trust each other. So this essentially allows us to be a trusted party in this communication by kicking out one of the parties. What this requires us to do is to spoof the IP address of one host, and then we need to predict what the current sequence number is, and we act that segment, and then basically we jump in the place of the host which we spoofed. There is also a denial of service attack that is called TCP SYN flood. Remember that to establish a TCP session, one host sends a SYN package, the other host will send back a SYN plus an ACK package, and the first host will send an ACK package. So when we do a TCP SYN flood attack, we send a large number of SYN packages to the device that we want to attack. That device will reply with those SYN ACK packages, and we do not send the final ACK in return. What happens then is that the host that we attack will have a lot of waiting handshakes. And, well, it will not really do anything, because all it does is it sits around and waits for handshakes. And when a legitimate user comes and wants to send a SYN request, well, then it's unavailable. So that's TCP SYN flood attacks, and one thing you can do to mitigate this is of course to make sure that one single IP can, for instance, not send too many SYN packages without sending an ACK in return. So let's round off with UDP attacks. Remember that UDP is a best effort alternative to TCP that is used when speed is more important than reliability, essentially. The UDP packets are called datagrams, and those do contain a checksum that is used by the receiving host to verify that the datagram has not been altered. However, this is not always used in reality, and that enables man-in-the-middle attack. So in this case, an attacker can just pick up a package, read the content, and then send it along. Or even modify the information in cases when the checksum is not being used. Then we have the UDP flood, which is an attack where an attacker floods a host with UDP traffics, and they use various port numbers. So you basically send packages to different ports using UDP. And the idea here, or the thing here, is that when a host receives a datagram on a closed port, it will reply with an ICMP port unreachable packet. And since many ports are closed, this will cause many ICMP packages to be sent, and that will in turn overwhelm the network. So this is another example of a denial of service attack. So that's also rather brief, I must say, and that's all. Feel free to leave questions in the comments field, and see you next time where we round off with the last part of this chapter 7.